How many conflicts within the church come about because we're thinking about ourselves and not truly loving other souls? Reminds me of Jonah chapter 3. We read about the people in Nineveh. They had turned away from their evil. I mean, Jonah was successful in his preaching, right? He went and he warned the people, and the people turned away, and they repented, and hey, they're not going to be destroyed anymore. And you would think, as the preacher Jonah, he would be so excited about that. But he was angry. He was so angry that God was no longer going to destroy the Ninevites then, that he praised to God and he asked God to let him die rather than to see them not destroyed. Jonah was angry because the people did not react the way he expected them to. Jonah didn't love those Ninevites. Jonah didn't love those lost people. He expected them to reject God's warning, and he was looking forward to see the price they were going to pay for that rejection. Jonah chapter 4, verse 4. God asked Jonah, he says, "Is it right for you to be angry? Is it right for you to be angry? Or is it right for you to be angry at these people from turning away from their evil?" Brethren, I think that's a question that we need to ask ourselves. When we feel anger burning up inside, when we feel like we're about to act out of our anger at something, we need to ask ourselves that same question that God asked Jonah. Is it right for you to be angry? If we can pause and think, look, is there any good that is going to come out of my anger with this person, with this situation, with this congregation? Is there any good that's going to come out of this anger? I think in moments like this, we tend to forget that these people that we're dealing with have souls as well. I think that's especially easy when we don't know the people closely. When we're dealing with strangers, you know, it's common to hear the phrase that the only sermon someone will hear is your example. Well, I think that's good. I think we can take that a little bit further. And when we think about that, the only exposure that strangers that come across your life may have to Christ's body is how you treat them in that moment of anger. Is how you treat them in that moment of inconvenience. That may be the only time they ever come that close to experiencing Christ. Instead of showing our anger, let us show Christ's love. Matthew chapter 5:16 says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." When you think about that, your light, what is going to show from you? It doesn't say, let your light so shine that people can see how angry you can be and how much you can show how you've been wronged and how quickly you can call them out and how bad you can make people feel for making a mistake. James chapter 1 verse 20 says, "The wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Brother, when we're looking at these passages and you think, if you profess to be a Christian, if you wear the name of Christ, then your light is your life. Your life, is it a representation of God? Is it a representation of Christ's love to that person? We need to be cautious that our lives don't represent something contrary to that. And in doing so, preach something false to those people that we're angry with. God is love. We know from the text that God is love, and therefore, if we are to obey God's commands, we must know more about God. We need to strive to understand God and how He works more. We know that godly love is shown through sacrifice, that true love demands sacrifice, and through putting others first, we see an ultimate example of putting others first by Christ dying on the cross for us. As we read in 1 John 4:9, "In this the love of God was manifest toward us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world that we might live through Him." It's one thing for God to say, I love you. It's one thing for God to tell us he loves us, but God's love was put on the ultimate display to the point that he sent his only Son, a spotless lamb, to walk this earth and to die a cruel death for us, for our mistakes, so that we can live for eternity through him. But then we can't ever repay God's love. We can't ever say, all right, well, I'm gonna make up for that. I'm gonna make up for that death. There's nothing we can ever do to repay God's love. But we can do more than just say, oh yeah, I love God. Oh yeah, I'm a Christian. We can display our love through our own self-sacrifice. Verse 10 there, 1 John 4 says, in this love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his only Son to be the propitiation for our sins. At the beginning I said, all right, we're going to try to define what true love is. That is true love. Not that we loved God, but rather he loved us. It's not that we loved God. It's not that we cared anything about God when he sent his Son to die for us. God loved us first knowing that we would not show him love. God loved us first knowing that his Son would need to go to that cross for our sins. Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, while we were not showing him any love at all, Christ willingly went to the cross for us. A lot of times in a strained relationship, but usually probably in a strained, maybe a marriage relationship, one person might say, I will show them love when they learn to show me love first. I will love them when they decide that they'll love me. Aren't you thankful that God's love doesn't work that way? Aren't you thankful that the love that Christ had for our souls did not work that way, where he said, when they show me love first, that's when I'll show them I love. God loved us when we were the most unlovable. We were the most undeserving, most unworthy, and most unappreciative. Because it's our sins that carried Christ to that cross. And God loved us in spite of them. It's not like God didn't know the cost. It's not like God didn't realize that he would have to send his Son to make that propitiation for our sins. The sacrifice was necessary to save us. Christ went willingly. 1 John 4:11 says, beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. This thing, because of God's example of love, we should love one another. Because of what God gave up by sending Christ to die on that cross, because of what Christ gave up for us, we should love one another because of what's at stake by not loving one another. But notice the language here in 1 John 4:11. It says, we ought to love one another. Now, this word ought here isn't used in the way that we use ought today, really. If I was to use ought today, I might say, hey, well, since you're going to be at the Branson Lectures, you ought to go over and see Silver Dollar City. That's something you ought to do while you're in town. I mean, it's right here, and if you've never been before, you ought to go do that. That's not what the ought is here. This ought here is more like saying, fish ought to swim. It's part of what they are. It's part of what they do. They can't survive without it. This is like saying an eagle ought to fly. It's what makes, essentially, it's what makes an eagle an eagle, is it flies. It ought to do that. And so when you think about it that way, this expresses the necessity of the action here. God loved us, so we ought to love one another. Because God loved us, it is part of who we are to love one another. It's part of our purpose. When we find ourselves wrongfully angry at someone to the point where we may be acting in an unloving way, we need to remind ourselves of the true cost of that love. We also need to remind ourselves that anyone who does not love does not know God. Think about not knowing God. There is nothing more important in this life than knowing God. And you cannot know God without love. One more thing I want to bring up about June, about pride, about that agenda that's pushed. I think it's very ironic that these groups have chosen a rainbow to show pride in living a way that's contrary to how God would have us live. We as Christians know that the rainbow is part of that promise that was made by God to never destroy the earth by flood again. But as the Christian, the rainbow should also remind us of some other things. It should remind us of the attitude that God has towards a sin-filled world. It should remind us of the promises that God will keep. When I see a rainbow, I absolutely think of that flood and think about how God won't destroy the earth again by flood, but I'm also reminded of the promise that this earth is temporary and that this earth will be destroyed one day. And I'm also reminded that we will be judged based off of the things that we do while on this earth. Matthew chapter 7, 21 through 23 says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, do mighty works in your name?' Then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" How important is it for us to know God and for God to know us? Matthew tells us we have to ensure that on that day we are counted amongst those that practice truth, that practice love, not just in appearance, but with true love. We need to ensure that we're counted amongst those that are described also in John 14:15. That true love is shown by those that keep God's commandments. Appreciate the opportunity to speak at this lectureship.
Thank you, John. You did not disappoint. Appreciate so much the lesson that you brought. I'm sorry that I did not get the information right about, you still work security in Walmart?
Work online now.
Oh, online security. Well, I'll just have to say, the things I know about you come from eavesdropping on the conversations of the girls in my family. They don't tell me anything. I had to pretend like I'm not listening, so I thought I had that right. But we do appreciate so much your participating in this. Your time is up. In just a few minutes, we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, and when we come back, John's father, Bill, is going to bring us the lesson. And so In the meantime, if you want to visit the restroom, get a drink of water, look at the displays that have been set up. I know there's still more to come that will be set up, so keep visiting the display area and talk to the people about those displays. I know they'd appreciate that. We are dismissed.